Welcome back, everybody, to part 3 of my look at alternate history hubs. What if Germany won World War II? Thank you guys so much for all the great feedback, the comments, the observations, your agreements and disagreements with me on this topic through the first 2 videos. If you didn't see the first 2 videos, I've put a link in the description that will take you back to my reaction to episode 1. There's also a link to the original content creator for episode 3, as well as a bunch of other links. And I'm going to be adding a link to the merch store because I'm realizing that though I have merch linked to the channel, it doesn't seem to always show up on every single video. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that in the link as well. I've also updated the patrons. So if you are one of the tier 3 and above patrons supporting this channel, check and make sure I have your name. Or if your name is listed the way you want it, let me know if you have any changes to that. Just send me a message on Patreon and I will update to reflect that and make sure that you're all listed appropriately for that. A couple of other things I want to let you know about. Tomorrow we are going to be streaming. I know a lot of you joined me for the stream today. It was just kind of a fun meme stream. Tomorrow, I'm going to be doing a stream showing you some of my favorite historic books that I have in my own personal collection, as well as giving you some recommendations about my favorite books for history for different topics. I'm also going to be announcing the winner of the logo competition. We've got a new logo that has been designed for the channel, and the vote has been pretty overwhelming in one direction for that. So we'll be ready to announce that. I'm already designing merch with the logo. So we'll be giving out the prize. I've already notified the winner that he's won, and I'll announce that to everybody tomorrow. Let's go ahead and dive into part 3.
Conquered Europe and now rules over its people and governments with an influential hand. The meaning of European is quickly being changed. Individuality has been sacrificed for unity amongst every member of nations. The new Aryan generation, and by extension other Europeans, are taught new curriculums. Europe against all, and against a new enemy. Not the Soviets, who have been pushed into the Siberian tundra, a force across the ocean, untouched by Nazi soldiers, the United States. If you haven't seen part 2 or 1, click here or in the description below to catch up. In part 3, I'm going to focus on how a Nazi victory has affected the United States. Europe may have fallen, but the United States, with its impressive economic force, still remained across the Atlantic.
And this is something I've been speculating about through the first 2 episodes, is what's happening in his timeline with the United States during all of this. Because in this timeline, the United States is still out there. They're still a threat. They haven't been conquered. They haven't been defeated. They're there. And as we've talked about, Germany, by its nature, Nazi Germany needs to have an enemy. Someone to fear, someone to be defeated, someone to mobilize your people against. And so now the United States becomes that.
How does this affect our alternate timeline? Here is one scenario. America comes in, sucker punches Hitler in the face, then nukes Europe while jumping into the ocean. The end. Like on Facebook and... No, I'm just kidding. An event like the Nazis conquering Europe certainly changes global politics, but it wouldn't automatically put the globe under Nazi domination. Nations left uninvaded now have to interact with the Third Reich in their own way. Some could become collaborators, others staunch enemies, others future targets. In this video, I'm going to focus entirely on just 2 nations, the United States and Nazi Germany. In this alternate timeline, Germany is able to secure Europe from outside American invasion. Even though the US could raise up a decent-sized army and military effort, the incursion into Fortress Europe would simply be suicidal, especially as the fascists begin reinforcing their holdings. While the other parts mention decades, this part will focus on the years immediately after Hitler defeated the British and continued to push back the Russians.
So I don't entirely agree that it would be suicidal for the UK or for the United States to land in Germany. In Europe. There's just no way that Germany could cover every part of their coast against an invasion. Common sense tells us that an invasion at somewhere like Normandy requires having the UK as a jumping off point. And remember, most of those troops that invaded from the UK had been there for quite some time. The guys like the 101st Airborne were there for the better part of a year before they invaded Europe. But remember, too, that the invasion of Normandy was not the first use of Allied troops on mainland Europe. The invasion of Sicily happens in the summer of 1943, and the Allies had pushed a good bit of the ways up the Italian peninsula by this point. But yeah, I mean, if you don't have the Soviet Union fighting on the Eastern Front, it does allow for Germany to concentrate a lot more forces in places like Italy, southern France, Normandy. I still don't know if I 100% agree that there wouldn't be somewhere, but it would be much harder because you don't have the jumping off points for an invasion, especially if the coast of Africa is not open to the U.S., so I could see how that could be much tougher.
In our timeline, the Pacific War and European War were disconnected from one another. Japan and Germany were both united in a goal for more living space for their people, but their alliance was one of convenience, not of ideological similarities. By the time Hitler had invaded Poland, Japan was already waging brutal war against the Chinese in French Indochina. This war was noticed by the Americans, who placed an embargo to convince the Japanese to stop aggression. This oil embargo crippled Japan, cutting off around 90% of their oil supply and immediately placing them in a crisis.
And you know, I don't talk too much about gaming. I do have a gaming channel I've had for 4.5 years called History Guy Gaming. Links in the description for that. I was actually doing a practice run playing on Hearts of Iron 4 as Japan, because that's what I'm going to be playing in our next multiplayer series. And it is impossible as Japan early in the game to have the oil you need without getting significant amounts of it from the United States. So I know I'm talking about a game, but yeah, that was a major factor in why Japan attacks the U.S. at Pearl Harbor as oil. They needed that oil to be able to do the other things they were doing. And I'll be interested to see where he goes with this, because you can't talk about the United States and Germany without talking about the United States and Japan. So I'm wondering how that war ended up in this timeline.
They could either stop their war effort, but instead they chose to go on the offensive, seize the natural resources of Southeast Asia, and negotiate with the Americans to maintain the land they conquered. Japan knew they could never win a total war against the economic might of the Americans, but if they were to cripple the US's fleet and stall their offensive capabilities, negotiation to Japan seemed like an option. In this alternate timeline, no matter if Hitler conquered Europe or not, Japan would have bombed Pearl Harbor to secure their own imperial ambitions. The United States is now at war with Japan in this alternate scenario as well. Yet even though the US does not want to wage a war against the fortified Germans, the Germans could still wish to fight a war against the Americans. In our timeline, Germany declared war on the US. Hitler did so under his own vision, and not because of any treaty obligation with Japan.
Yeah, and that's one of the most mystifying parts of history, is why did Hitler go out of his way to declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor? It wasn't a foregone conclusion that the U.S. was going to immediately declare war on Germany. I think they probably would have at some point in 1942, but I don't quite understand why Hitler chose to do that.
Hitler had many misconceptions about the power of Japan and the weakness of the United States. In our timeline, Hitler's advisors warned that a war against the US only would harm the Reich. However, Hitler dismissed their opinions. This alternate timeline can be split between two different scenarios, each created from one decision: whether Nazi Germany would declare war on the United States. So, first scenario, Hitler decides to go to war. If Nazi Germany successfully defeated their enemies in Europe, a declaration of war by the Reich would be much more of a threat in this alternate timeline. When Hitler declared war in our own timeline, it was seen as an opportunity for the Americans to get involved in the war. Even though the situation in 1941 was grim, it was not lost. Germany was fighting on two fronts, and declaring war on America brought a new player into the European theater.
And though that's true, it was decided pretty early on that, well, I should say it is true, and that Germany would be the first focus for America, the UK, etc. Because remember, the UK is also fighting Japan in the Pacific. But yeah, they decide pretty early on that they're going to make Germany the focus, defeat Germany, finish them off, then worry about finishing off Japan. It's not that they weren't fighting both at the same time. So I'll be curious to see how it affects the war in Japan, what happens in Europe.
German leaders knew that Germany had no capabilities to strike the US directly. In this alternate timeline, the Germans would need to invest in long-range bombers to attack the US, creating the Amerika Bomber project. In our timeline, Hitler always wished to bomb the East Coast with nuclear or conventional weapons, yet he focused resources on weapons of science fiction, and not on easily achievable inventions such as long-range bombers. In this scenario, even if the Amerika Bomber is developed, the aircraft couldn't fly from North America and back, so it would need to be sacrificed over enemy territory. A simple bombing run wouldn't be worth destroying a plane over, so the payload needed to be greater. If a war between the Americans and Germans began in this alternate timeline, it's unlikely either could or want to launch a land invasion into the enemy continent. It would be too costly. The war between both is on two phases: conventional air and naval warfare, and the race for nuclear weapons. The atomic bomb wouldn't be the weapon to end the war as in our timeline against Japan, it would be a weapon to make bombing runs worthwhile across the Atlantic. In this alternate timeline, whoever developed a nuclear weapon and successfully could drop it on the enemy has the political and military advantage over the other.
Now, I will say this about nuclear weapons, about the atomic bomb. There is no way Germany was getting an atomic bomb. I know a lot of people like to speculate, well, could Germany have developed the bomb? No. Couldn't happen. Even in the best case scenario. Number one, they had expelled a lot of the scientists they would have needed to develop such a project in the 1930s. But more than that, the resources, even with Germany conquering Europe, the resources just weren't there for Germany. If you look at the resources that were put into and the manpower that was put into the Manhattan Project by the United States, at one point, I think something like 20 or 25% of all the electricity that was being used by the Manhattan Project, especially down in Tennessee where they were enriching the uranium and that was needed in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I mean, people don't even have a clue how much money, manpower, and resources went into developing just those two bombs. Well, three if you count the one that they did at the Trinity test site. Germany didn't have the capability of building that bomb. I'm sorry, I just don't see a scenario where that's ever possible.
So the race is on. Neither would gain a reasonable advantage in the naval campaign, and so war is simply to defend coastal cities from the other. Even though Japan attacked the United States, Germany was much more of an immediate threat. Most American technological resources would go to getting an advantage over Germany, coastal defenses, and preparations for German bombing runs. However, Japan still attacked the US, so the US would still fight a Pacific War against the Japanese. Japan never would have been able to defeat the Americans. The US controlled their oil supply, and both sides knew Japan was outclassed economically by the United States. Japan couldn't rebuild lost ships. US could. For Japan, it was always going to be a losing battle. This alternate Pacific War could be very similar to our own, considering nothing occurs in the mainland US up until the very end.
And again, an excellent point. And Japan knew this. There is no scenario in which Japan was going to win a long-term war with the United States. They had to hit the US hard and fast and hope that the US would negotiate something. A long-term scenario always favors the U.S. It was only a matter of time. So things like the Battle of Midway. Midway did not determine the outcome of the war in the Pacific. It determined the length of the war in the Pacific. Had Japan won a victory at Midway, the outcome wouldn't have changed. It just might have taken longer. So that's really the bottom line.
In our timeline, the only reason the atomic bomb was allowed to drop was because the political climate allowed it. Japan's allies were defeated, Japan was isolated, and the US was tired of war. There were no major political repercussions for such a final act. In this alternate timeline, even if the United States had a nuclear bomb, they wouldn't use it on Japan. They would only use it on Germany if they had the opportunity, as was the original plan before the defeat of Hitler in our timeline. If the US pushed Japan back in this alternate scenario, the policy is to contain and firebomb the Japanese homeland. Firebombings of Japanese cities killed more than the nuclear bombs. Since to the Americans the Japanese aren't important enough targets for nuclear weapons, the Americans simply destroyed Japanese will and economic capability to wage war.
And the firebombing was something that happened a lot in Europe as well. Look at what happened to the city of Dresden. Firebombing was brutal. It was ugly. It was... I mean, you can't even wrap your mind around what some of those civilians went through in those cities.
the conventional way. So in this alternate scenario, the US obliterates Japan's cities nationwide, devastating the entire country. After months of Dresden-style bombings on Japan, the country literally cannot fight anymore. If Japan surrendered, we'd see a similar occupation as in our timeline. If not, the US invades and the air bombings obliterate every Japanese town and village. The populace cannot fight off an invasion, no matter their willpower. This alternate path is only possible if the United States develops a nuclear weapon before Nazi Germany. So would Germany have gotten the bomb before the United States?
No way.
No. In our timeline, many factors led to the US having an advantage over the Germans in nuclear development. The US had both British and German scientists who were scared of the Nazis. Also, Germany could not invest as much energy into nuclear research as Americans, as most German effort went into the Russian conflict. Yet even with some changes by the alternate timeline, it's unlikely the Germans could have held on to their new territory and developed a nuclear bomb while at naval war with the United States.
Completely agree.
The US, who would deal with much less internal pressures, has a greater advantage over the Nazis. Just because the US would create a bomb first, does not mean Germany could not create a bomb at all. Even with a nuclear attack in this alternate timeline, it wouldn't cripple a nation. It'd be a political blow, maybe even a tool to create unrest, but realistically brings the world into an age where nuclear warfare is the new normal. An atomic strike by either side in this alternate timeline is a dangerous prospect, as while devastating, it still allows the other nation to retaliate back. So
And here's the thing too with the bomb. It's not like the US, once they dropped the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had a bunch of these things sitting around. I mean, it took a ton of effort and manpower and production just to get those 2 bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy. It wasn't like they had 8 or 10 more of these things ready to go. So it wasn't like nuclear warfare could have been a regular part of things for the U.S.
Including in this alternate timeline, if the United States and Germany did go to conflict, it's very likely it would collapse into nuclear war, even limited nuclear war, with cities on the coast such as New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. being destroyed. As the devastation would commence, protests and riots would occur as people fear for their lives across both Europe and North America. As rocket technology advances, the nuclear war could expand across the continents, in a scenario very similar feared in the Cold War.
See, again, I just don't see a scenario where Nazi Germany has a bomb and is able to use it. So I disagree with the idea that you're going to end up in like a mutually assured destruction type of thing. At least not right away. I mean, maybe a few years later, like the Soviets did, like in the late 40s, maybe Germany gets it, but not in the World War II timeline.
Utterly destroying both nations as nukes bring social unrest to even the Third Reich itself. Now earlier I mentioned there would be 2 different scenarios which could occur from one decision. The first was Hitler decides to go to war. The second is Hitler decides not to. In the second scenario, Hitler listens to his generals and realizes that it isn't in his best interest to help Japan and attack the US. So in this alternate scenario, the US can focus all of its energy on Japan in the Pacific War. Still pretty similar as in our timeline. However, the Americans are in constant worry that Hitler may change his mind and launch a naval war against the US in the Atlantic. In our timeline, after the atrocities of the Holocaust and the millions of deaths in Hitler's war, Nazism was discredited forever. Americans can't imagine fascism ever being considered. However, before the war, in the turbulent Great Depression, the boasting, flag-toting fascists certainly had an appeal to some in North America, even among prominent American capitalists. In our timeline before the war, company leaders admired Adolf Hitler for his boasting personality. Hitler won over many prominent American businessmen with cheap labor policies. Both parties shared similar views on communists and labor forces. Both parties were incredibly anti-Semitic, as many were at the time. Germany in the 1930s became a suitable market for American companies to invest in, no matter what their government said. Even during the war itself, American companies remained in contact with their German counterparts. In this alternate timeline, without a war, this relationship blooms to its full potential. With the Nazis having won the war and resistance practically useless, companies are the first to accept the new order as a valuable market.
So, I hesitate a little bit on this one because even though, say, January 1942 comes and Hitler hasn't declared war on the United States, the U.S. was heavily invested in the Allied cause at this point, with Lend-Lease, sending a ton of supplies and military equipment and armaments and stuff to the UK and to the Soviet Union. So even though we weren't actively in the war, we were actively in the war. So maybe after there's peace, eventually there comes a time where economic ties are possible between the U.S. and Germany, but certainly not during the war years.
In our timeline, Hitler held complex views of the United States. He saw that the country had a sizable population of ethnic Germans, and attributed most of the country's accomplishments to them. Yet he also despised the influence of the Jewish and black populations in the country. He admired the U.S. racial segregation and eugenic policies it employed on minorities. Hitler believed that the Aryan majority of the United States was being controlled by a government under a Jewish conspiracy. He personally hated President Roosevelt. Since the Nazis had relatable views already held in many places in the US, segregation, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, without a war, the Nazis would become less despised by parts of the country as years went on. The Nazis were still German, which was better to the US than the Japanese.
And this is an important point, and whether people will outright acknowledge this or not, there was definitely a difference between how Americans viewed their German enemies and how they viewed their Japanese enemies. Now, you could argue that part of that is, well, Japan launched a sneak attack on Hawaii. So that's why they were hated more. You could argue that the way that the Japanese treated American POWs was very different than how the Germans treated American POWs, which is also true. So some of that was, I guess you could say, justified. The more hatred toward Japan than there was to Germany. But there's absolutely a racial and a heritage point of view on this. There are, as he said, a lot of Americans who claim German ancestry. In fact, in the census, more Americans claim German ancestry than anything else. Now, it's not true that more Americans have German ancestry than anything else. It's just that more Americans claim German ancestry than, say, claim British ancestry, because that ancestry goes back a lot further, and people aren't as closely tied to their English heritage, for example. So people identify with Germans more than they do with Japan. They're white Europeans versus Asians. There's a lot of factors in that, but it's absolutely true.
Would this mean the American public would accept Nazism? With fascism certainly establishing itself by force in Europe, would it leak into the American political atmosphere as well? In the 1930s, fascism never gained mainstream traction. It was simply anti-American in the political sense. Even groups like the KKK, which preached for white supremacy, still disagreed with Adolf Hitler's authoritarianism.
And we have to say this about the Klan. By the time World War I, World War II come along, you can't think of the Klan the same way you do thinking of the KKK in the 1860s, 1870s. In the 1860s, 1870s, it's very much created to deal with freed slaves, and the hatred runs deep toward African Americans. By the 1910, 1920, 1930, the Klan had very much shifted a lot of its focus to being anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, things of that nature. Particularly Catholic Italians were hated by the Klan. There was a huge, tens of thousands of Klan members in a rally here in the 1920s in Northeast Ohio. And it was mostly anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Italian.
The Constitution was still seen as the greatest government document to run the country. In this alternate timeline, the success of Hitler in Europe inspires homegrown groups inside the United States. True political authoritarian fascism never would take off in the US. However, the social views of racial segregation and anti-Semitism could easily be more reinforced and appeal to the American whites.
Possible.
In this alternate timeline, if the United States and Nazi government never went to war, some American whites would attempt to model their country's social policy off of the Germans, at least to an extent. As the civil rights movement gained steam, many whites would look to the Nazis. In this alternate timeline, if Nazism did not crash and the Third Reich remained prominent, it could influence populations far outside its empire. Americans might even view the Nazis as destroyers of communism, as the Soviet Union was incredibly unpopular amongst the population. If Nazi Germany boomed economically, the success drives even more Americans to Nazi beliefs. Civil rights progress is set back decades as Nazism is an influence for Europeans across the globe.
I can see that. A German victory in World War II would certainly have a negative impact on the civil rights movement in the United States. I absolutely agree with that. It's not something I would have thought about, but I'm glad he brought that up.
While the two countries officially would be cold enemies, the US holds many Nazi sympathizers. These sympathizers can vote, creating a potential Nazi base within the US voter population. Politics change in the US revolving around whether to befriend or to hate the Third Reich. Since Hitler's decision not to go to war with the US does not end in a nuclear war, this scenario of Nazi and American fragile peace is the one which we continue with for the rest of the series. In Part 4, the United States is left with a choice: to accept the new order which has fallen on Europe, or to continue in a path of defending its interests and allies, even the former British Empire, which now is headed by the royal family across the Canadian border.
Interesting. So I'm curious to see where this goes next. Let me know your thoughts about everything we just talked about. Make sure that you have your notifications turned on so that you'll know when I go live with the stream tomorrow. And thank you in advance for all of your support for this channel. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.